What if I told you that 5 minutes ago, the United Kingdom made a decision so drastic, so unprecedented, that historians are already calling it the most explosive royal upheaval of the century? What if I told you that Parliament, the same institution that once defended the monarchy during its darkest scandals, has now voted to permanently exile Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from Britain? Not suspend, not investigate, not censure. Exile. Let that word sink in for a moment. Exile. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. When was the last time you heard a modern nation exile a member of its own royal family? Not in a global conflict, not in a constitutional crisis, but in response to a couple who once stood at the center of a global fairy tale, waving from palace balconies, embraced by millions. So you're probably thinking, what in the world could have possibly pushed Parliament to this point? What information was so shocking, so forceful, that MPs across party lines set aside their differences and cast a vote that will echo across history? And perhaps the bigger question, why now? Why this moment? Why today? The truth is, this story didn't begin this morning. It didn't even begin this year. This vote is the tipping point of a long, twisted saga filled with contradictions, secret meetings, leaks, rising tensions, and a growing sense, shared by both officials and ordinary citizens, that the situation with Harry and Meghan had spiraled far beyond public drama. This wasn't just about the couple anymore. Not about interviews. Not about Netflix deals. Not about memoirs or estranged family ties. Something else happened. Something Parliament could no longer ignore. But before we get there, before we unpack the confidential file that reportedly sparked today's emergency session, you need to understand the atmosphere inside Britain right now. You need to feel the pressure building, the frustration simmering, the emotional fatigue that has reached everyone from senior MPs to taxi drivers to the staffers who work deep inside the palace corridors. Because this vote wasn't just political. It was emotional. It was cultural. It was symbolic. It was personal. So let's start with the first moments of this breaking story. Picture this. Cameras swarming the entrance of Parliament, reporters scrambling to make sense of the chaos, rumors swirling that an emergency vote had been called with no warning whatsoever. Parliament wasn't scheduled to make any royal-related decisions today, yet MPs were rushing in, phones pressed to their ears, aides holding folders, red faces, frantic whispers. Chaos. And then, the announcements. Members were told to take their seats. Phones switched off. Doors locked. A closed session. That alone was enough to send social media into an absolute meltdown. But what came next pushed the entire nation into a frenzy of speculation. Because insiders leaked one simple, chilling line from the speaker before he sealed the doors. Members of Parliament, you are about to review material that has been classified at the highest levels. Just imagine hearing that. Imagine hearing a line usually reserved for war briefings or intelligence emergencies, now being used in connection with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Doesn't that raise questions? Doesn't that make you wonder what could possibly be inside that sealed folder? And here's the twist. Not even all the MPs knew beforehand. Some were blindsided. Some reportedly believed they were walking into a routine policy session. Others were unaware anything royal was even on the agenda. But once those confidential pages hit the desks in front of them, it all changed. But let's pull back for a moment and look at the larger picture. For years, Britain has been caught in a strange and exhausting tug-of-war between defending the monarchy and dealing with the tension Harry and Meghan brought every time new allegations or interviews surfaced. One moment, they were admired as the glamorous global couple breaking away from outdated traditions. The next, they were accused of manipulating narratives, distorting events, and dragging the royal institution through the mud. Some of you watching right now might have been rooting for them early on. Maybe you loved their wedding. Maybe you admired Harry for standing up for his wife. Maybe you believed they were trying to modernize a centuries-old institution. But at what point did public sympathy start to fracture? When did people start feeling as though something wasn't adding up? Was it the Oprah interview? The Netflix series? Harry's memoir? Or was it the growing sense that every time the monarchy tried to move forward, another controversy mysteriously erupted? Another statement, another accusation, another headline. And yet, none of that is enough to justify exile. Not in a democracy, not in a constitutional monarchy. You don't exile someone because you don't like their interviews or because they reveal private conversations. That's not how modern nations work. Which brings us back to today. Something new surfaced. Something big. And clearly, something Parliament believed could not remain hidden. But before we jump to the dramatic turn inside the House of Commons, let's talk about why this moment struck Britain so deeply. For many people across the country, today's vote wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about monarchy versus anti-monarchy. It was about identity, about loyalty, about the meaning of home. Think about Harry for a second. This is a man who once walked behind his mother's coffin while the entire world watched in silence. A man who served on the front lines in Afghanistan. A man who grew up with unimaginable pressure. A man who millions thought would one day be a stabilizing force for a new generation of royals. And yet here we are. A prince voted out of the country he was born into. A prince the Parliament just declared persona non grata. Can you imagine the emotional weight of that? Can you imagine what it must feel like? Now, of course, Meghan Markle's presence complicates everything. Depending on who you ask, she's either the modern heroine who tried to bring change into a rigid institution, or the mastermind who engineered a calculated exit that destabilized the monarchy. Those two narratives have been battling each other for years, and today's vote only poured gasoline on the fire. But again, this wasn't a popularity contest. This was Parliament. This was a legal decision. This was scrutiny on a national level. And the real surprise? The vote wasn't close. That's the part no one expected. When the numbers came in, you could feel the shockwave ripple through the room. Some MPs nodded solemnly, believing it was the only way to prevent further chaos. Others looked genuinely stunned, as though they were witnessing history writing itself in real time. Outside, crowds had already gathered, some cheering, some furious, some completely confused. News outlets cut into programming. Social media exploded. Former palace aides began leaking cryptic quotes. Political commentators scrambled to process what had just happened. Meanwhile, somewhere across the Atlantic, Harry and Meghan's team was reportedly blindsided. But the biggest question remains, what was in that confidential file? What information was so catastrophic that Parliament felt compelled to act immediately, without debate, without delay, without hesitation? That's the question we'll unravel throughout this story. Because inside that file lies the truth that forced today's unprecedented decision. Inside that file are the revelations that flipped the entire narrative. And inside that file is the one detail, the one shocking detail, that MPs say made exile not just a political choice, but a moral obligation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we reveal the contents, you need to see the build-up. You need to understand what was happening behind the scenes. You need to understand the tensions that had been boiling behind polite smiles and diplomatic statements. Because today's vote wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. And what happened next, the moment the final vote was announced, would set off a chain reaction no one could have predicted. But that part of the story is still ahead. Because just when MPs thought the session was over, just when they believed all the revelations had been shown, something else happened. Something that made even the most seasoned politicians shift in their seats. Something that would push this story from shocking to unbelievable. Something that would change everything. What if I told you the tension inside the House of Commons didn't begin with shouting or debates, but with silence? An uneasy, suffocating silence that made even the most seasoned members of Parliament glance at each other with the kind of nervous energy you only see when something is deeply wrong? What if I told you that the moment Parliament finally snapped wasn't loud, but quiet? That the spark wasn't a speech, but a single man standing up, holding a sealed folder marked with 3 words that froze the entire room? Strictly confidential. Imagine that moment. An MP rises. Not dramatically, not angrily. Just slowly. He holds a folder that looks unassuming from a distance. Cream-colored, thin, almost fragile, but the red stamp across the top makes the entire chamber lean forward. It's the type of stamp normally used for national security briefings, military threat reports, intelligence memos, not royal family matters. But here it was, a classified file, connected to Harry and Meghan. Can you picture it? Do you feel that shift, that tightening of the room? MPs who came in expecting routine discussions on domestic policy suddenly found their pulse quickening. Some sat up straighter. Others exchanged looks of confusion. A few even frowned, as if realizing the gravity of the moment before anyone had spoken a word. And that MP, whose name the press has not yet revealed, cleared his throat and said only this: "Members of Parliament, the material you are about to review requires immediate action." Immediate action. Those two words alone are enough to raise eyebrows anywhere. But inside Parliament, they hit like a shockwave. So what exactly was happening behind those doors? What triggered that emergency gathering? Why did the Speaker authorize a session that wasn't even on the day's agenda? Let's break down the atmosphere in the minutes before everything erupted. It started with murmurs. A few MPs reported receiving urgent texts from aides. Others heard whispers in the halls about a last-minute security courier arriving at Westminster. Some speculated that the briefing was related to foreign affairs. Others thought it was about domestic threats. No one thought it had anything to do with the royal family. Not until that folder appeared. The MP handed it to the Speaker, who looked down at the cover page and reportedly went pale. A silence stretched through the chamber, long enough for some to wonder if the Speaker was about to postpone the entire session. But instead, he nodded. He approved the briefing. And that's when everything changed. The chamber doors were locked. Phones were confiscated. The press was cleared out. A rare closed session was called. Closed sessions are almost unheard of for royal-adjacent topics. They're reserved for matters of national security, urgent intelligence, or unprecedented crises. And that's what made the tension so thick. No one could understand what on earth Meghan and Harry could possibly be involved in that would justify this level of secrecy. But you know what made it even stranger? The folder wasn't large. No stacks of documents. No binders. No extensive reports. Just a thin file. A thin file powerful enough to trigger the most aggressive parliamentary response in years. And that leaves a massive question hanging in the air. What could possibly be inside it? Before the contents were revealed, the Speaker warned the room with a single sentence that leaked almost immediately. What you are about to hear may permanently alter your view of events leading up to this vote. Imagine hearing that as an MP. Would your pulse skip? Would you brace yourself? Would you feel dread? Especially if you believe the situation with Harry and Meghan had already spiraled out of control? Because here's the thing. Parliament had endured years of tension around this couple. Years of statements. Years of scandals. Years of contradictory interviews, royal pushback, media battles, internal investigations, and disputed narratives. But nothing had ever escalated to this point. Not until today. Let's walk through the room. Picture yourself inside that chamber. On the right, several MPs sit with arms folded, suspicious but focused. Some were known critics of the couple, though none had ever argued for anything remotely close to exile. On the left, MPs with more relaxed stances began whispering, trying to piece together the reason behind the closed session. In the back, younger MPs traded glances, confused by the sudden escalation. Even the cabinet ministers looked uneasy. These were not people easily rattled. The uncertainty in that room wasn't just political. It was emotional. It was visceral. Everyone could feel that something irreversible was about to happen. And then, the Speaker nodded. The MP opened the folder, and the first page, the very first page, sent a ripple through the chamber. Gasps, sharp inhales, chairs scraping lightly as people shifted, stunned. Some MPs reportedly looked horrified, others angry. A few sat completely still, processing the gravity of what they were reading. Not a word was spoken, not yet. Because the entire room knew that the first page was only the beginning. You see, the atmosphere in that chamber didn't erupt because of politics. It erupted because what was in that file didn't match the public narrative. It didn't match previously released statements. It didn't match the accounts the couple had given in interviews. It contradicted things. Important things. Official things. And contradictions, especially in matters linked to national image, trust, or diplomatic implications, are a red line Parliament doesn't take lightly. So here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. Why would Parliament need classified information about Harry and Meghan? Why would intelligence agencies even be involved? Why would the contents be so sensitive they had to seal the chamber? And why did the first page alone cause such an immediate reaction? Because according to insiders who later leaked details, the information contained in that classified file touched on 3 areas Parliament could not ignore: national integrity, diplomatic relations, and potential harm to the monarchy's stability. Think about that list for a second. National integrity, diplomatic relations, monarchy stability. Those are not tabloid topics. Those are not gossip column issues. Those are the pillars of Britain's identity and political structure. And here they were, apparently compromised, threatened, or undermined in ways Parliament had not anticipated. The reactions inside the chamber grew more intense with every paragraph read aloud. A Conservative MP reportedly slammed a hand on the desk, demanding immediate explanation. A Labour MP leaned forward, eyes narrowed, scanning the text as if trying to verify its authenticity. A centrist MP covered her mouth, shaking her head. Another whispered, "How did this go unnoticed?" The speaker maintained composure but looked increasingly strained, as though the responsibility of managing this revelation weighed heavily on him. And yet, despite the shock, no one interrupted. Every MP listened. Every MP processed. Every MP understood that the information they were reviewing wasn't something that could be ignored. It wasn't something that could be leaked casually. It wasn't something that could be debated publicly. It required action. Immediate action. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Among the MPs present, several insiders claimed that what shocked them wasn't just the content, but the source. The file reportedly included a section that cited an unexpected source of intelligence, a source no one believed had been involved until that very moment. And if that's true, if that source really did provide information, then this story extends far beyond Harry and Meghan, far beyond Britain, far beyond royal disputes or public controversies. It means there were eyes on them that no one knew about, eyes no one expected, eyes that brought information Parliament couldn't overlook. But again, that's part of what we'll uncover as this story unfolds chapter by chapter. Because revealing everything now would destroy the tension Parliament felt in real time. And trust me, you want to feel exactly what they felt. Because the next part of this chapter is crucial. After the first page was read, after the murmurs began spreading across the chamber, the MP reading the file paused. He looked up. His voice reportedly trembled, not from fear, but from the awareness that what he was about to read next would change the trajectory of the nation's relationship with the Sussexes forever. He read the second page, and that's when the chamber snapped. Voices rose. MPs pointed fingers. Some demanded immediate removal. Some demanded a vote. Some demanded the couple be barred from returning until a full investigation was completed. Some argued there was no room for delay. But almost no one argued against taking action. That was the moment Parliament snapped. Not because of emotions alone, not because of politics, but because the contents of that file made inaction impossible. The speaker tried multiple times to restore order. When he finally did, he made one statement that would anchor the entire session. You have now seen the evidence. The motion for permanent exile is hereby tabled. Permanent exile. A motion so drastic, so unprecedented, that even MPs who had prepared themselves emotionally were stunned. The motion passed through initial procedural stages within minutes. Not hours. Minutes. Because whatever was in that file, and we will unravel every detail, was considered a threat too large to ignore, too dangerous to delay, too compromising to let linger. But what came next? What happened after the file was read? What new revelation pushed Parliament from shock to unanimous action? What final detail turned this from a debate into an emergency? You're about to see exactly what triggered the next level of chaos. Because moments later, just when MPs thought they'd seen everything, another document surfaced. A second leak, more explosive than the first. When did admiration turn into suspicion? When did applause turn into whispered criticism? For decades, the British public has loved their royal family. They cheered at weddings, mourned with them at funerals, and followed their lives with an almost obsessive attention. But with Harry and Meghan, something shifted. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but the cracks widened until today's unprecedented vote. The vote to exile them permanently. Let's rewind and examine the journey that led to this breaking point. Because if we don't understand the context, if we don't understand how public opinion and political tension intertwined, today's decision will seem shocking, but also senseless. It began long before interviews, Netflix deals, or headline-grabbing appearances. Prince Harry, the younger son of Diana, Princess of Wales, carried the weight of public expectation from a very young age. He was watched constantly, criticized constantly, and yet celebrated for courage and service. His military service added to the image of a prince devoted to his country, someone willing to step into danger for the sake of others. Enter Meghan Markle. The American actress, independent, outspoken, and far removed from the centuries-old traditions of British royalty. For some, she represented progress, a modernizer, a break from the rigid, hierarchical, and historically white-dominated institution of monarchy. For others, she represented disruption, a force that could destabilize centuries of protocol. The wedding in 2018 was billed as a global fairy tale. Millions watched as Harry and Meghan exchanged vows in Windsor Castle. But even then, beneath the glitz and glamour, tensions simmered. Palace aides reportedly whispered about the challenges ahead: cultural clashes, media scrutiny, and the delicate balance of integrating an outsider into the royal family machine. Early controversies were subtle, almost ignorable. A disagreement over wardrobe protocol, a perceived slight at a public event, a casual comment misinterpreted by the press. But in aggregate, these small cracks began to erode the public's perception. People who had once cheered now squinted suspiciously. People who had once admired now asked questions. What is Meghan really here for? What is Harry really doing? Then came the interviews. The carefully crafted appearances that were meant to humanize the couple ended up exposing raw fractures. Every word, every expression analyzed, every smile scrutinized for hidden meaning. And in some cases, there was more than interpretation, there was outright contradiction. Statements made in one interview were challenged by previous public records. Assertions of personal experience were questioned by those who remembered the events differently. Social media amplified everything. Outrage spread faster than clarification. One controversial headline could ignite a firestorm in seconds. And the couple, to their credit or fault depending on whom you ask, did little to stem the narrative. Often, their responses were perceived as defensive. Other times, calculated. The result: the public perception of Harry and Meghan became a pendulum swinging wildly between admiration and suspicion, support and critique, loyalty and betrayal. Let's not forget the memoir. Spare, Harry's explosive book, added fuel to the fire. Readers discovered intimate details about family dynamics, institutional frustrations, and personal struggles. While some praised the honesty, others were outraged. How could a prince publicly air grievances against his family? How could he disclose private details without consequence? And then there were the Netflix series and other media projects. The couple's narrative control became evident. They were no longer just participants in royal life. They were storytellers, shaping public perception to fit a vision that often clashed with established history. Again, reactions were split. Fans called it empowerment. Critics called it manipulation. But despite the media battles, despite the controversies, none of this alone explains why Parliament would consider exile. That's the key. Public criticism, media backlash, and book revelations could spark outrage, but exile is legal and institutional. It requires proof of a threat, or at least the perception of one. So how did it escalate to today? How did admiration and mild criticism turn into a parliamentary decision that shocked the nation? Part of the answer lies in perception. The monarchy is not just a family, it's a symbol. Any perceived threat to its stability triggers extreme measures. And Harry and Meghan, intentionally or not, became symbols of destabilization. Consider this: every public interview, every media appearance, every perceived slight added to a growing dossier of concern. Royal aides compiled reports, advisors whispered warnings, and government officials began noticing patterns. Not patterns of individual misbehavior alone, but patterns that suggested a systematic undermining of the monarchy's image. At the same time, the couple's attempts at privacy clashed with transparency expectations. When Harry and Meghan sought to control their narrative abroad, they inadvertently fueled domestic suspicion. Their actions overseas were interpreted through a British lens, often less forgiving than the American or international perspective. For example, philanthropic initiatives or public speeches in the United States were framed by some as self-serving or opportunistic. Local commentators questioned why the couple, financially independent, would need so much public attention for personal projects. And the contradictions piled up. On one hand, The couple claimed to support mental health advocacy. On the other, leaked accounts suggested internal tensions and staff departures, including high-profile aides leaving amid allegations of conflict. On one hand, they argued for transparency. On the other, many documents and communications remained private, fueling speculation and suspicion. This duality, between public persona and private reality, created fertile ground for political action. Parliament doesn't usually act on emotion, but it does respond to patterns that threaten national institutions. And by 2025, a clear pattern had emerged. Harry and Meghan's actions, combined with public controversies and internal palace friction, created a perception that the monarchy could no longer weather further storms without formal intervention. But perception alone still isn't enough for exile. That required evidence, intelligence, and something more concrete than media headlines. That's why the confidential folder in Chapter 1 was so critical. Because for Parliament, the folder wasn't just about public opinion. It contained information that transformed subjective suspicion into actionable rationale. It's also important to recognize the role of timing. Every controversy over the past few years had built toward this breaking point. Each interview, each media appearance, each leaked memo had layers that, when combined, created a sense of urgency. The 2023 admissions in Harry's memoir regarding past drug use, for example, sparked renewed debate about character, responsibility, and suitability for public life. Those debates, amplified by political actors and think tanks, reached a crescendo just as the confidential information surfaced. And let's not forget the emotional context. Many in Britain felt personally betrayed. They had supported this couple. They had celebrated their marriage. They had admired their philanthropy. But over time, repeated contradictions, perceived disloyalty, and public critiques of the royal family built a collective frustration. Parliament, ultimately a reflection of the electorate, responded in kind. This chapter of their history, the rocky road with Britain, illustrates the culmination of multiple forces: public sentiment, media scrutiny, institutional pressure, and personal choices. Each factor alone might have been manageable, but combined, they became a perfect storm, setting the stage for today's historic vote. So when you hear the phrase, Parliament voted to exile Harry and Meghan, understand this. It wasn't a snap decision. It wasn't a whim. It was the result of years of tension, accumulation of perceived missteps, and the sudden emergence of information that transformed opinion into decisive action. And now, as we move into the next chapter, you're about to see the first leaked reports that Parliament could not ignore. These reports, the hidden files, the intelligence briefings, the previously suppressed evidence, are what finally turned suspicion into legal and political action. They're what escalated a long-standing story of public opinion into an immediate, unprecedented parliamentary vote. Imagine sitting in the chamber of Parliament, eyes fixed on a folder, knowing that what you're about to read could shift the trajectory of history. That's exactly where the MPs found themselves the moment the first leaked reports surfaced. Not news articles, not tabloids, not interviews. Real, unfiltered documents, classified, sealed, and delivered straight to Westminster. And what they contained was far more explosive than anyone outside these walls could imagine. The first leaked report was a combination of internal memos, intelligence briefings, and correspondences between high-ranking palace aides and external advisors. The documents had one purpose: to outline risks associated with Harry and Meghan's actions over the past few years. But the language inside the files was chilling. Compromising information, potential destabilization, national and diplomatic implications. These were phrases repeated throughout. MPs reportedly leaned over desks, whispering in disbelief. Some read and reread sentences, unable to process the weight of the words. Others sat back, shaking their heads, as if trying to convince themselves it was a mistake. But the file was real, and it was immediate. One of the most striking revelations centered around previously unknown communications between Meghan Markle and external organizations. According to the report, some of these communications raised concerns not just about image management, but about influence over political and media narratives. For instance, certain high-profile initiatives aimed at reshaping public perception had, according to the report, been coordinated with a level of secrecy that suggested a deliberate attempt to circumvent traditional royal protocols. And then there was Harry. The report outlined instances where his personal decisions, especially surrounding media interviews and memoir disclosures, had unintended consequences for national security and diplomatic relations. Details were included that Parliament had never seen before. Private correspondences, meeting notes, and internal advisories painted a picture of actions taken without oversight, sometimes contradicting advice from palace officials. But it wasn't just individual actions. The report suggested patterns. Patterns of media manipulation. Patterns of public messaging inconsistent with palace standards. Patterns that, cumulatively, raised serious concerns about loyalty, discretion, and responsibility. The MPs realized that this wasn't a matter of miscommunication. It was systemic. And yet, here's the twist. Not all the evidence in the report was incriminating. Some sections highlighted the couple's charitable initiatives, their work in mental health advocacy, and their attempts to engage with underrepresented communities. These sections created a paradox. On one hand, there was undeniable achievement and dedication to social causes. On the other, there was a growing perception of recklessness and disregard for institutional stability. The contradictions were staggering. MPs asked themselves, how could the same couple who raised millions for charity, appeared to champion social causes, and worked on global initiatives also be perceived as such a threat to national and institutional stability? How could admiration for humanitarian work coexist with such serious concerns that exile was being considered? And this is where the tension reached its peak. Because the report included new evidence that the public had never seen. Internal assessments of media strategy and communications. These assessments indicated deliberate coordination with media outlets, publicists, and social platforms to manage public perception in ways that, according to the documents, undermined royal authority. Imagine the room at that moment. Some MPs reportedly gasped aloud. Others pressed hands to their foreheads. A few walked out briefly, unable to process the shock. The energy in the chamber was electric. And as the files were passed from desk to desk, the murmurs of disbelief grew louder. Then came the section that reportedly triggered the most outrage: intelligence briefings regarding potential influence on international relations. The leaked reports suggested that certain statements and appearances by Harry and Meghan were causing measurable diplomatic tension with Commonwealth nations. Ambassadors had reportedly expressed concern, and foreign officials had privately questioned the UK government about the implications. For MPs, this was more than embarrassment. This was national credibility. A constitutional monarchy relies not just on tradition, but on stability. And here was evidence that two individuals, previously celebrated globally, were causing friction in diplomatic channels. But the reports didn't stop there. There was an entire section dedicated to leaked internal memos and private correspondences that revealed patterns of internal palace conflicts. Staff departures, allegations of undermining colleagues, reports of mismanagement and tension. These were all included as supporting evidence. Some MPs reportedly remarked that they had never seen such detailed documentation of internal royal disputes. And yet, the most controversial part of the reports wasn't about Harry or Meghan individually. It was about the couple's collective influence. The documents suggested that their joint public narrative had created an external perception of institutional dysfunction. Every interview, every Netflix deal, every book release had, in the eyes of some officials, cumulatively weakened confidence in the monarchy. Now, here's an interesting paradox. Some MPs reportedly expressed sympathy during the session. They recognized that the couple had been under extreme pressure, that their choices were complicated by constant media scrutiny, and that part of their behavior could be attributed to stress and trauma. But even with that acknowledgement, the overarching concern remained. Could Britain continue to allow these patterns to persist without serious consequences? It was this tension between sympathy and institutional concern that made the chamber electric. It was palpable. You could feel the room teetering between outrage and understanding, between restraint and immediate action. And then, just when MPs thought they had processed the first layer of shocking revelations, the report dropped a second bombshell. Certain communications between Meghan Markle and external organizations, which had previously been private, were disclosed in a way that suggested not only media coordination, but strategic influence over key public narratives. And more astonishingly, some of these correspondences were timestamped during critical events that Parliament considered sensitive, times when national stability could have been impacted. This was more than controversy. This was a potential constitutional threat, according to the interpretation of several MPs who reviewed the files. And it created an urgent, almost panic-driven need for action. The phrase, immediate action, was no longer just a formal warning. It became a rallying cry inside the chamber. But here's where it gets even more dramatic. Several MPs later confirmed that the files included a hidden section, what insiders now call the Category Red portion. This section contained information that, if verified, would directly challenge prior statements made by Harry and Meghan in both interviews and public communications. Essentially, the documents suggested that some claims made by the couple had been contradicted by internal records, some of which were corroborated by foreign sources. Imagine the shock. Imagine realizing that statements you assumed were truthful were now being called into question by official records. And imagine that these records weren't just trivial. They had serious implications for national and diplomatic stability. That is why Parliament couldn't ignore these reports. That is why the vote for permanent exile was tabled. That is why MPs went from shock to action in a matter of hours. But even after reviewing these leaked documents, a sense of dread lingered. Because while the first report painted a damning picture, insiders hinted at an even more explosive second leak, one that contained visual evidence, time-stamped interactions, and direct links to both international concerns and domestic fallout. Just when members of Parliament thought they had seen the full extent of the revelations surrounding Harry and Meghan, the second leak arrived. And unlike the first, which was already enough to make the chamber tense, this one carried a level of shock that no one could have anticipated. Some MPs later described the reaction as utter disbelief. Others admitted to fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of the public reaction, fear of what this meant for Britain's monarchy and national stability. Imagine the scene. Papers shuffled, whispers spread across the benches, aides exchanged anxious glances. And then, one MP stood up, holding the second document. No dramatics. Just a quiet intensity that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. The title was innocuous, almost boring. Supplementary Review, Strategic Communications and National Impact. But the contents were anything but boring. From the very first page, the leak made it clear that the couple's actions were being tracked not only domestically but internationally. Communications with foreign media outlets, timing of public statements, and interactions with influential organizations overseas were meticulously documented. The documents suggested coordination intended to influence public perception in Britain while simultaneously managing global narratives. A strategy Parliament had never seen from a member of the royal family. What truly horrified the MPs, though, were the timestamps. Several communications coincided with highly sensitive political events, including foreign visits, key governmental announcements, and high-level diplomatic meetings. Some officials interpreted these actions as deliberate, others as reckless. But everyone agreed on one point. This was unprecedented. And then there were the visuals. The second leak included images, screenshots, and verified correspondence showing Meghan and Harry engaging in private communications that contradicted public statements they had made over the last several years. These weren't rumors. These weren't speculative interpretations from journalists. These were verified records. Hard evidence. Direct proof. One particularly controversial section outlined communications during a period when the royal family was managing a highly sensitive international matter. The report suggested that statements made by the couple, though subtle and carefully phrased, risked undermining official government communications. In simple terms, MPs were faced with evidence that the Sussexes had, intentionally or not, complicated Britain's diplomatic messaging. Some MPs reportedly slammed their hands on desks. Others whispered that they had never imagined such information would exist. A handful of veteran members, who had served for decades, admitted feeling stunned by the sheer audacity, or recklessness, contained in the pages before them. And yet, the leak didn't only highlight potential missteps or breaches. It also revealed internal deliberations within the couple's team. Strategy documents suggested that every public appearance, every interview, every book excerpt had been carefully timed and crafted to maximize media coverage and shape public opinion. Some MPs interpreted this as savvy public relations. Others saw it as manipulative and potentially damaging to national trust. The contradictions were staggering. On one hand, the couple was praised globally for philanthropic work, advocacy, and efforts to modernize the monarchy's public image. On the other hand, their methods raised serious questions about discretion, loyalty, and the appropriate boundaries for a royal outside official duties. How could a couple who appeared so charitable also be a source of institutional instability? Then came the most damning revelation. Direct evidence of communications that suggested coordination with external political entities. Sources describe this as unprecedented and alarming. To have members of the royal family potentially influencing public perception while engaging with external groups raised questions about neutrality, influence, and, ultimately, legality. For MPs, this was a turning point. It was no longer just about perceived missteps or contradictions. This was about tangible actions, documented and verified, that could impact both the monarchy and Britain's standing internationally. The room grew heavier with each page turned. Some members began whispering about historical precedents. Could a royal ever be permanently exiled? Would legal mechanisms even allow it? Others debated whether this was a temporary measure or a permanent decision waiting to happen. The answers weren't clear, but the urgency was undeniable. And then, as if the room wasn't already tense enough, the second leak introduced an even more controversial section: financial dealings. Certain agreements and sponsorships were revealed, some of which conflicted with guidelines set for royal family members. While not illegal, they raised questions of propriety, ethics, and whether these arrangements undermined the credibility of the institution. Some MPs reportedly gasped at these revelations. Others scribbled notes furiously, trying to process the implications. Social media, still largely unaware of the confidential leak, would later explode once fragments of the report were leaked to journalists. By the time the press caught wind of the story, speculation had already taken root. The public was outraged, supportive, and deeply divided. Exactly the scenario Parliament had hoped to address behind closed doors. And then came the kicker. The final pages of the second leak suggested that these communications weren't isolated. They were ongoing. Patterns were established. And according to analysts inside the chamber, these patterns could not be ignored if Britain wanted to maintain trust, stability, and the symbolic power of the monarchy. It's important to pause here and understand the scale of this revelation. We're not talking about minor mistakes or oversights. We're talking about sustained, documented evidence of behavior that, while not criminal, posed serious questions about responsibility, discretion, and the broader implications for national and international perception. By the time MPs had finished reviewing the leak, it was clear immediate action was required. There was no room for delay, discussion, or compromise. The vote wasn't just politically motivated. It was a response to a tangible, documented pattern of behavior that Parliament could no longer tolerate. And here's the final twist of this chapter. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the room was divided, not along political lines, but along emotional lines. Some MPs felt deep sympathy for the couple, recognizing the pressure they had endured and the scrutiny they had faced. Others felt betrayal, believing that the very institution they sought to protect had been manipulated, undermined, or endangered. That tension, that mix of empathy and outrage, is what made the final vote so historic. Because when Parliament finally tabled the motion for permanent exile, it wasn't done lightly. It was done with the weight of evidence, with the collective realization that no amount of public goodwill or media spin could mitigate the consequences of these leaks. And just when MPs thought they had seen the full story, aides quietly handed another envelope to the Speaker. The contents? Something so sensitive, so shocking, that even seasoned MPs reportedly froze. Some said it changed the entire trajectory of the session. Some called it the final piece of the puzzle. This final revelation would ultimately seal the decision, pushing Parliament from deliberation into irreversible action. Imagine the moment the Speaker of the House received the final envelope. Silence fell like a physical weight across the chamber. Every MP, every aide, every official felt it. This wasn't just another document. This wasn't just another leak. This was the piece that would define the session, shape history, and ultimately decide the fate of Harry and Meghan in Britain. The room went still. The usual whispers, the low hum of paper rustling, even the subtle creak of chairs, everything stopped. Members leaned forward instinctively. Some clutched their desks, unable to believe what was about to unfold. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, trying to prepare themselves for the shock that they somehow knew was coming. The envelope was handed to the speaker, who opened it with a careful precision. Inside were several pages marked with a single word in bold red letters. Confidential, top secret. These weren't ordinary documents. They were compilations of evidence, corroborated from multiple sources, containing information that Parliament had never seen before. And the first page made it immediately clear why this session had escalated so quickly. The document outlined a series of communications and decisions involving Harry and Meghan that directly intersected with national security concerns. Details included interactions with foreign nationals, coordination of public messaging during sensitive periods, and communications that, according to intelligence analysts, could have compromised diplomatic relationships. Imagine the MPs reading this. Not speculation, not rumor, verified documentation, evidence that even seasoned lawmakers described as unprecedented for members of the royal family. The atmosphere shifted from concern to urgency. Then came the section that reportedly caused the most outrage. Internal communications showing that the couple's team had systematically tried to influence the timing of media releases to coincide with political events. Essentially, while the UK government and monarchy were managing delicate situations, Harry and Meghan had been orchestrating narratives that ensured maximum media impact for themselves. Some MPs reportedly slammed their desks in disbelief. Others covered their faces with hands, muttering under their breath. Even those sympathetic to the couple admitted the revelations were impossible to ignore. Patterns were clear. Actions weren't isolated. Influence was deliberate. And for Parliament, the implications were devastating. And yet, the document also revealed something deeply personal. Notes from palace aides expressing concern over the psychological pressure Harry and Meghan were under, fears about public scrutiny, and attempts to manage the situation internally without escalation. This juxtaposition between institutional concern and personal empathy created a profound emotional tension inside the chamber. MPs were faced with a moral dilemma: act decisively or risk further destabilization of national institutions. But the most explosive section was yet to come. The document contained details that contradicted public statements made by the couple, directly challenging their interviews, public claims, and previous disclosures. Some MPs reportedly whispered that they couldn't believe these contradictions existed in such a clear, verifiable format. Evidence of discrepancies spanned multiple years, multiple countries, and multiple media appearances. The revelations weren't just damaging, they were strategic. They showed a level of planning and foresight that Parliament had not anticipated. The documents suggested that Harry and Meghan had not merely reacted to media narratives. They had actively shaped them, sometimes in ways that conflicted with institutional priorities, diplomatic relations, and national interest. For many MPs, this was the tipping point. Sympathy alone could not justify inaction. Public goodwill, charitable work, or personal challenges were now secondary to the overwhelming evidence of institutional risk. And yet, the chamber was divided. Some members wanted a measured response. Some advocated for temporary exile. Others argued for permanent restrictions, citing the risk of ongoing influence and instability. Debate was heated but quiet, punctuated by the weight of the evidence. Every word spoken carried gravity. Every pause felt deliberate. Then came the vote. The speaker tabled the motion for permanent exile. The room collectively held its breath. This wasn't just a political decision, it was historic. Modern Britain had never enacted permanent exile against members of its royal family. Not in the 20th century. Not in the 21st. The decision carried legal, constitutional, and symbolic weight that would resonate globally. As votes were cast, the implications became clear. The motion would pass, and with it, Harry and Meghan's status as members of Britain's royal family would be permanently altered. Headlines would explode. Social media would erupt. The public would be divided as never before. And the couple, thousands of miles away, would face a reality they could no longer influence or control. But here's the chilling detail. According to insiders, even after the vote was tabulated, some MPs were not fully aware of the final sections of the document. Hidden within the envelope were additional notes, codified intelligence, and supporting materials that further reinforced the decision for permanent exile. These pages suggested that the risk posed by the couple was ongoing, that patterns were likely to continue if no decisive action was taken, and that public exposure or media mismanagement could exacerbate institutional instability. And in that moment, as Parliament formally moved toward exile, the Speaker reportedly leaned over and whispered to senior aides, "This is irreversible. History will judge this day." Outside the chamber, the reaction was immediate. News vans flooded Westminster. Crowds gathered. Some cheered. Some protested. Some simply stared in disbelief. Social media exploded with speculation, outrage, and confusion. The global audience, millions of people who had followed the couple's story for years, watched in shock as Britain's government took unprecedented action. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan's team was reportedly blindsided. Advisors scrambled for explanations. Lawyers consulted emergency measures. Public statements were considered, delayed, and revised multiple times. But the decision was final. Exile was no longer theoretical. It was reality. Yet, even with this dramatic unfolding, one question lingered. Could there be another revelation lurking just beneath the surface? Another leak, another hidden document, another piece of evidence that would further complicate the story? Insider sources hinted that the envelope, although comprehensive, might not have contained everything. That possibility kept MPs, aides, and officials on edge, understanding that this was only one chapter in an ongoing saga. But as of that day, one fact was undeniable. Harry and Meghan had been exiled. Britain had enacted a decision that would forever alter the monarchy, public perception, and the couple's own lives. And just when Parliament believed the session had concluded, aides whispered of an impending press briefing. Details were being cleared for journalists. Statements would be released. The public narrative would shift instantly. And one more revelation, still unseen, was reportedly being prepared for disclosure. A detail that could inflame the public even further and create unprecedented consequences for both Britain and the Sussexes. The moment Parliament announced the permanent exile of Harry and Meghan, Britain, and indeed the world, erupted. Social media blew up with hashtags, opinions, memes, and outrage. News outlets scrambled to report the unprecedented move. Television anchors repeated the same line over and over. Historic decision, unprecedented action, royal exile confirmed. But that barely scratched the surface. Imagine watching live coverage as crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Protesters waving signs. Supporters holding banners. Reporters narrating the chaos with barely concealed excitement. The atmosphere was electric. Emotions ran high. Some shouted shame. Others screamed justice. A few stood silently, processing the gravity of the moment. This wasn't a simple public response. It was a cultural rupture. A historic fracture in the relationship between the monarchy, its members, and the public. For decades, Britain had revered its royal family, navigating scandals carefully, smoothing over internal conflicts. But this? Exile was different. Exile was a line that had never been crossed in modern times. Media outlets, both domestic and international, had already obtained fragments of the leaked documents. Sensational headlines dominated every platform. Sussexes exiled. Britain breaks its own tradition. Harry and Meghan permanently barred from UK. Monarchy shocked, public divided. Every article attempted to summarize the leaks, the evidence, and the parliamentary proceedings. But the public, hungry for more drama, quickly noticed inconsistencies and contradictions between reports. And here's where it gets even more chaotic. The couple's own statements, released through a carefully orchestrated media team, conflicted with several of the leaked documents. Public relations messaging described the couple as deeply disappointed and shocked by the decision, while the leaks indicated long-standing awareness of the potential consequences. The result? a credibility battle that inflamed social divisions further. Social media, as always, didn't just comment, it fueled the fire. Platforms were flooded with personal reactions. Some sympathized with the couple, framing the exile as unfair or politically motivated. Others celebrated it, calling it long overdue. Analysts later observed that this digital uproar amplified public perception, transforming what might have been a contained political event into a global spectacle. Television coverage added to the frenzy. Every major network broadcasted live reactions, interviews with experts, former royal aides, and even historians. Some commentators argued that the decision was an inevitable consequence of the couple's actions. Others claimed it was a political overreach that could damage the monarchy's reputation for decades. Even royal experts who normally maintain neutrality couldn't hide their astonishment. Former palace insiders described the events as unprecedented and potentially destabilizing, citing the combination of leaked documents, public perception, and global attention. Meanwhile, international media compared the situation to political exile, not royal precedent. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to critical, depending on the outlet's editorial stance. But the real shock came in the details that were slowly emerging. Analysts began digging into the leaked documents, connecting dots that had not been obvious during the parliamentary session. They discovered that the patterns highlighted in the second leak extended far beyond media manipulation. Financial arrangements, international engagements, and private communications suggested an operational network. Effectively, a strategic campaign that Parliament interpreted as undermining the monarchy and the state's interests. Public sentiment, as measured by polls taken immediately after the vote, revealed an intense polarization. Roughly half of the respondents expressed outrage at the exile, framing it as cruel or unprecedented. The other half supported Parliament's decision, citing the leaked documents as evidence that decisive action was necessary. Analysts noted that this polarization was higher than during any previous royal scandal in modern history. And the confusion wasn't just domestic. Across the globe, audiences tried to make sense of the narrative. Americans, Canadians, Australians, and other Commonwealth nations debated whether this was an overreach or a justified intervention. Opinion pieces proliferated, each interpreting the leaks and Parliament's actions differently. Even former heads of state were quoted speculating about the implications for constitutional monarchy, international diplomacy, and media influence. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, aides were reportedly working around the clock. Security protocols were tightened. Internal briefings were conducted to prepare staff for potential unrest. Every detail of the exile process, from legal arrangements to personal accommodations for Harry and Meghan, had to be coordinated meticulously. The stakes were enormous. This wasn't just a political event. It was a logistical and symbolic operation designed to preserve stability while executing an unprecedented decision. And yet, despite the elaborate planning, chaos seeped through. Rumors spread about potential leaks from within the palace. Some claimed that members of the staff were sympathetic to the couple and might reveal further details. Others suggested that international media outlets had received advanced copies of certain documents, setting the stage for a prolonged media battle. The public reaction became increasingly unpredictable. Crowds outside the palace grew in size and intensity. Protests clashed with supporters, creating a tense atmosphere that required police intervention. Social media amplified every incident, with videos going viral almost instantly. Analysts noted that the combination of public outrage, global attention, and media frenzy had created a feedback loop. Every new post, every new broadcast added fuel to the fire. And here's a crucial point. For Harry and Meghan, the exile wasn't just symbolic. It had practical implications. Their UK-based projects, charitable engagements, and public appearances were now either suspended or relocated. Financial arrangements tied to their UK presence required renegotiation. Legal teams scrambled to interpret the scope of the exile, including questions about titles, privileges, and the use of the term royal. Even personal matters were affected. Close family members faced the emotional fallout. Friends, colleagues, and staff members found themselves caught in the crossfire, navigating the delicate balance between loyalty, discretion, and legality. Every interaction, every statement had the potential to influence public perception, complicate legal proceedings, or create new diplomatic tensions. And as the day progressed, it became clear that the media storm was far from over. Leaks continued to surface. Analysts published deep dives into financial arrangements, interviews, and strategic communications. Public opinion polls shifted hourly. Social media debates escalated into national conversations, and global outlets continued to frame the story in dramatic, often conflicting ways. But here's the cliffhanger. Amidst all this chaos, insiders whispered of another leak, an even more sensitive set of documents that had yet to be released. This material allegedly contained information about private conversations, undisclosed decisions, and potentially explosive revelations that could change the public narrative entirely. Few people outside Buckingham Palace knew exactly what happened behind its doors in the hours following Parliament's historic vote.